Master looked at Loken. "Do you think this also?" "Yes, Lord." "Then I am troubled that I will have to countermand you both. I respect your efforts to safeguard me. Your strenuous loyalty is noted. Now take me to the Hall of Devices." The hall was on fire. Bursting fields exploded through the lower depths of the place and cascaded flames up into the higher galleries. A meterge player, blackened by smoke, limped out to greet them. "Have you not sinned enough?" he asked, venomously. "What is it you think we have done?" Horus asked. "Petty murder. Asheroth is dead. The hall is burning. You could have asked to know of our weapons. You had no need to kill to win them." Horus shook his head. "We have done nothing." The meterge player laughed, then fell. "Help him," Horus said. Scads of ash were falling on them, drizzling from a choking black sky. The blaze had spread to the over-sweeping forest, and the street was flame-lit. There was a rank smell of burning vegetation. On lower street tiers, hundreds of figures gathered, looking up at the fire. A great panic, a horror was spreading through Zenobia Principis. "They feared us from the start," the War Master said. "Suspected us. Now this. They will believe they were right to do so." "Enemy warriors are gathering on the approach steps," Kyrus called out. "Enemy?" Horus laughed. "When did they become the enemy? They are men like us." He glared up at the night sky, threw back his head, and screamed a curse at the stars. Then his voice fell to a whisper. Loken was close enough to hear his words. "Why have you tasked me with this, Father? Why have you forsaken me? Why? It is too hard. It is too much. Why did you leave me to do this on my own?" Interrex formations were approaching. Loken heard hooves clattering on the flagstones and saw the shapes of mounted Sagittars bobbing black against the fires. Darts, like bright tears, began to drizzle through the night. They struck the ground and the walls nearby. "My lord, no more delays," Torgadon urged. Gleaves were massing too, their moving spears black stalks against the orange glow. Sparks flew up like lost prayers into the sky. "Hold!" Horus bellowed at the advancing soldiers. "In the name of the Emperor of Mankind, I demand to speak to Naud. Fetch him now." The only reply was another flurry of shafts. The lunar wolf beside Torgadon fell dead, and another staggered back, wounded. An arrow had embedded itself in the War Master's left arm. Without wincing, he dragged it out and watched his blood spatter the flagstones at his feet. He walked to the fallen Astartes, bent down, and gathered up the man's bolter and sword. "Their mistake," he said to Loken and Torgadon. "Their damn mistake, not ours. If they're going to fear us, let us give them good reason." He raised the sword in his fist. "For the Emperor," he yelled in Chthonic, "illuminate them!" "Lupercal! Lupercal!" answered the handful of warriors around him. They met the charging Sagittars head-on, bolter fire strobing the narrow street. Robot steeds shattered and tumbled, men falling from them, arms spread wide. Horus was already moving to meet them, ripping his sword into steel flanks and armored chests. His first blow knocked a man-horse clear into the air, hooves kicking, crashing it back over onto the ranks behind it. "Lupercal!" Loken yelled, coming to the War Master's right side, and swinging his sword double-handed. Torgadon covered the left, striking down a trio of Gleaves, then using a lance taken from one of them to smite the pack that followed. Interrex soldiers, some screaming, were forced back down the steps or toppled over the stone railing of the street to plunge onto the tier beneath. Of all the battles Loken had fought at his commander's side, that was the fiercest, the saddest, the most vicious. Teeth bared in the firelight, swinging his blade at the foe on all sides, Horus seemed more noble than Loken had ever known. He would remember that moment, years later, when fate had played its cruel trick and sense had turned upside down. He would remember Horus, War Master, in that narrow firelit street, defining the honor and unyielding courage of the Imperium of Man. There should have been frescoes painted, poems written, symphonies composed, all to celebrate that instant when Horus made his most absolute statement of devotion to the throne, and to his father. There would be none. The hateful future swallowed up such possibilities, swallowed the memories too, until the very fact of that nobility became impossible to believe. The enemy warriors, and they were enemy warriors now, choked the street, driving the War Master and his few remaining bodyguards into a tight ring, a last stand. It was oddly as he had imagined it, that night in the garden, making his oath. Some great last stand against an unknown foe, fighting at Horus's side. He was covered in blood, his suit gouged and dented in 100 places. He did not falter. Through the smoke above, Loken glimpsed a moon, a small moon glowing in the corner of the alien sky. Appropriately, it was reflected in the glimmering mirror of the ocean out in the bay. "Upakal!" screamed Loken. 4. "What was taken?" Mercedy Ollerton asked. "A weapon, so they claim." "One weapon?" "We didn't take it," Loken said, stripping off the last of his battered armor. "We took nothing. The killing was for nothing." She shrugged. She took a sheaf of papers from her gown. They were Carcass's latest offerings, and she had come to the arming chamber on the pretense of delivering them. In truth, she was hoping to learn what had befallen on Zenobia. "Will he tell me?" she asked. He looked up. There was dried blood on his face and hands. "Yes," he said. The Battle of Zenobia Principis lasted until dawn, and engulfed much of the city. At the first sign of commotion, unable to establish contact with either the War Master or the fleet, Abaddon and Aximand had mobilized the 2 companies of lunar wolves garrisoned at the Extranus. In the streets surrounding the compound area, the people of the Interrex got their first taste of the power of the Imperial Astartes. In the years to come, they would experience a good deal more. Abaddon was in wrathful mood, so much so that Aximand had to rein him back on several occasions. It was Aximand's units that first reached the embattled War Master on the upper tier near the Hall of Devices, and fought a route to him through the cream of Naud's army. Abaddon's forces had struck at several of the city's control stations and restored communications. The fleet was already moving in response to the apparent threat to the War Master and the Imperial parties on the ground. As Interrex warships moved to engage, landing assaults began, led by Sedere and Targost. With communications restored, a full-scale extraction was coordinated, drawing all Imperial personnel from the Extranus and from fighting zones in the streets. Horus sent one final communique to the Interrex. He expected no response, and received none. Far too much blood had been spilled, and destruction wrought, for relations to be soothed by diplomacy. Nevertheless, Horus expressed his bitter regret at the turn of events, lamented the Interrex for acting with such a heavy hand, and repeated once again his unequivocal denial that the Imperium had committed any of the crimes of which it stood accused. When the ships of the expedition returned to Imperial space, some weeks later, the War Master had a decree proclaimed. He told the Mournival that, upon reflection, he had reconsidered the importance of defining his role and the relationship of the 16th Legion to that role. Henceforth, the Lunar Wolves would be known as the Sons of Horus. The news was well received. In the quiet corners of the flagship archives, Kirill Sindamin was told by some of his iterators and approved the decision, before turning back to books that he was the first person to read in 1,000 years. In the bustle of the retreat, the remembrances, many of whom had been extracted from the Extranus by the Astartes' efforts, cheered and drank to the new name. Ignace Carcassy sank a drink to the honor of the Legion, and Captain Loken in particular, and then had another one just to be sure. In her private room, Euphrates Keeler knelt by her secret shrine and thanked her god, the Emperor of mankind, in the simple terms of the Lectitia Divinitatus, praising him for giving strong and honorable men to protect them. Sons of Horus, all. Air hummed down rusting ducts and flues. Darkness pooled in the belly vaults of the vengeful spirit, in the bilges where even the lowliest ratings and proto-servitors seldom strayed. Only vermin lived here, insect lice and rats, gnawing a putrid existence in the corroded bowels of the ancient ship. By the light of a single candle, he held the strange blade up and watched how the glow coruscated off its edge. The blade was rippled along its length, grey like napped flint, and caught the light with a glitter like diamond. A fine thing. A beautiful thing. A cosmos-changing thing. He could feel the promise within it breathing. The promise and the curse. Slowly, Erebus lowered the anatheme, placed it in its casket, and closed the lid. "And that is all?" "We tried," said Loken. "We tried to bond with them. It was a brave thing, a noble thing to attempt. War would have been easier. But it failed." "Yes," he said. Loken had taken up the lapping powder and a cloth, and was working at the scratches and gouges on his breastplate, knowing full well the scars were too deep this time. He'd have to fetch the armorers. "So it was a tragedy?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded, "but not of our making. I've never felt so sure." "Of what?" she asked. "Horus, as War Master, as the Emperor's proxy. I've never questioned it, but seeing him there, seeing what he was trying to do, I've never felt so sure the Emperor made the right choice." "What happens now?" "With the Interrex, I imagine attempts will be made to broker peace. The priority will be low, for the Interrex are marginal and show no inclination to get involved in our affairs. If peace fails, then, in time, a military expedition will be drawn up." "And for us? Are you allowed to tell me the expedition's orders?" Loken smiled and shrugged. "We're due to rendezvous with the 203rd Fleet in a month, at Sardis, prior to a campaign of compliance in the Coyotes cluster. But on the way, a brief detour. We're to settle a minor dispute. An old tally, if you will. First Chaplain Erebus has asked the War Master to intercede. We'll be there and gone again in a week or so." "Intercede where?" she asked. "A little moon," Loken said. "In the Davin system."
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.